The robbery went wrong in seconds. 3 armed men, hostages taken, police surrounding the building. But inside, a security guard who'd never raised his voice above a whisper suddenly became someone else entirely. The same hands that had stamped parking passes now moved with lethal precision, because muscle memory from Fallujah doesn't fade. Welcome to Interesting Human Stories. Before we dive into this gripping tale of hidden warriors and split-second heroism, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that heroes walk among us in disguise, hit that subscribe button. These stories reveal the extraordinary people hiding in plain sight. The Metropolitan Financial Tower stood 42 stories above downtown Seattle, its glass and steel facade reflecting the gray Pacific Northwest sky like a mirror. Inside, 3,000 employees worked for various financial firms, law offices, and consulting companies, moving through their days with the focused intensity of people who measured success in billable hours and quarterly profits. On the 3rd floor, behind a modest security desk in the building's main lobby, sat Robert "Bob" Patterson. At 52, he carried the soft appearance of a man who'd spent too many years behind a desk, his security uniform stretched tight across a frame that had once been lean and hard. His thinning brown hair was always neatly combed, his face clean-shaven, and his manner unfailingly polite to the hundreds of people who passed his station each day. To the building's tenants, Bob was invisible, part of the infrastructure, like the elevators or the air conditioning. They'd swipe their badges, nod absently at his good morning, and hurry to their elevators without giving him a second thought. If pressed, they might have described him as pleasant enough, maybe a former cop who'd taken an easy job in his later years. They would have been wrong about nearly everything. Bob arrived at work every evening at 6 p.m. for the night shift, relieving Danny Morrison, a younger guard who handled days. Bob preferred nights, fewer people, less small talk, more time to think. He'd settle into his chair with a thermos of black coffee and whatever paperback thriller he was reading, monitoring the building's security cameras and checking in night cleaning crews, and the occasional workaholic pulling late hours. The routine was comfortable, predictable, and deliberately mundane. Bob had chosen this life carefully, seeking anonymity after 22 years of living in shadows so deep that most people couldn't imagine them. The man who now checked visitor IDs and walked hourly rounds through empty hallways had once been Chief Petty Officer Robert Patterson, SEAL Team 6, with a service record that remained classified 15 years after his retirement. Bob's transformation from elite special operations warrior to mall cop security guard hadn't happened overnight. The transition had been gradual, measured in therapy sessions, prescription medications, and the slow recognition that the skills that had made him invaluable to his country had made him nearly unemployable in civilian life. SEAL Team 6 didn't exist on paper. Officially, it was known as DEV-GRU, the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Bob had spent 12 of his 22 Navy years with the unit, conducting operations that would never appear in history books in countries that the United States wasn't officially visiting, against enemies whose names would never be spoken in congressional hearings. He'd been good at it. More than good, he'd been exceptional. His psychological profile noted unusual calm under extreme stress, and his after-action reports consistently praised his tactical innovation and decisive leadership. He'd led dozens of missions, saved countless lives, and eliminated threats that most people would never know had existed. But the human psyche wasn't designed to carry that kind of weight indefinitely. The nightmares had started during his 3rd deployment, fragments of faces and voices that visited him during sleep. The hypervigilance had followed, an inability to sit with his back to a door, a compulsive need to identify exits and potential threats in every room he entered. By his final deployment, Bob had developed what his medical records euphemistically called operational stress reaction. He'd completed his missions, maintained his performance standards, and given no outward sign of the internal erosion that was slowly destroying his ability to function in normal society. The retirement had been voluntary, technically. Bob had served his 22 years and earned his pension, but his commanding officers had made it clear that his psychological evaluations were trending in a direction that would eventually require mandatory separation. Better to leave with full honors than to wait for the inevitable. The first years after leaving the Navy had been the hardest of Bob's life. He'd tried various jobs that theoretically matched his skill set: private security, corporate consulting, law enforcement, but each had presented problems that his military experience hadn't prepared him to handle. Private security often involved working for companies with flexible ethics, protecting clients whose business practices Bob found morally questionable. Corporate consulting required political skills and networking abilities that he'd never needed to develop in the military. Law enforcement seemed promising initially, but Bob's tactical training made him appear overly aggressive to supervisors who worried about liability issues. The underlying problem was that Bob's most valuable skills, close quarters combat, weapons expertise, tactical planning, were essentially useless in civilian contexts. Worse, the psychological conditioning that had made him effective in combat situations made it difficult for him to relate to people who hadn't shared similar experiences. His marriage hadn't survived the transition. Linda Patterson had married a confident young sailor and watched him transform into someone she barely recognized, quiet, distant, struggling with depression and anger management issues that he couldn't explain without violating classification restrictions. The divorce had been finalized 3 years after his retirement, taking with it Bob's connections to their 2 children, who'd moved across the country with their mother. The job at Metropolitan Financial Tower had been a last resort, found through a veterans employment agency that specialized in placing former military personnel in positions that required security clearances and steady temperaments. The work was simple, undemanding, and allowed Bob to maintain the low profile he'd come to prefer. 3 years into his security job, Bob had achieved something resembling stability. He lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment 10 minutes from work, drove a reliable used Honda, and had developed a routine that minimized stress and unexpected complications. His coworkers knew him as reliable and competent, but not particularly social. He declined invitations to after-work drinks, company picnics, and other gatherings that required extended interaction with people who couldn't understand his background. It was easier to maintain polite distance than to navigate the complex social dynamics of civilian friendships. The building's tenants had gradually stopped noticing him altogether, which suited Bob perfectly. He'd learned their names, recognized their faces, and understood their patterns of behavior, information that his training had taught him to collect automatically, but he kept his observations to himself. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a psychiatrist with offices on the 15th floor, always worked late on Wednesdays and left the building around 10 p.m. James Chen, a corporate lawyer, frequently brought clients for after-hours meetings that usually involved raised voices and slammed doors. Maria Santos, an accountant for several small businesses, often stayed until midnight during tax season, surviving on vending machine coffee and determination. Bob's detailed mental catalog of the building's occupants and their routines had been developed unconsciously, a residual habit from years of reconnaissance training. He didn't think of it as intelligence gathering. It was simply how his mind processed information. Every person was a potential threat. Every routine was a pattern to be analyzed. Every deviation was an anomaly requiring assessment. This automatic threat analysis had served him well during his military career, but it was also a constant reminder of the psychological conditioning that separated him from normal society. Bob couldn't walk through a shopping mall without identifying cover positions and exit routes, couldn't sit in a restaurant without cataloging potential weapons and escape paths. The evening that changed everything began like any other. Bob arrived at work at 6 p.m., exchanged brief pleasantries with Danny, and settled into his routine. The building was quieter than usual, a few lawyers working late, a cleaning crew on the upper floors, and Dr. Martinez conducting what appeared to be an evening therapy session. Around 8 p.m., Bob noticed something that triggered his trained instincts, a van parked across the street that hadn't been there earlier, positioned where it could observe the building's entrances but wasn't visible from most office windows. The vehicle looked ordinary enough, white panel van, no obvious markings, but it had been there for over an hour without anyone entering or exiting. Bob made a note in his incident log and began paying closer attention to the building's perimeter cameras. At 8:30, he spotted 2 men in dark clothing conducting what appeared to be a reconnaissance walk around the building's exterior. They moved with purpose but tried to appear casual, checking their phones and pausing at seemingly random intervals. A civilian might have dismissed these observations as paranoia, but Bob's training had taught him to recognize hostile surveillance when he saw it. Someone was gathering intelligence for an operation against Metropolitan Financial Tower, and that operation was likely to occur soon, probably while the building was lightly occupied but not completely empty. Bob considered calling the police, but he had no evidence of criminal activity. 2 men walking around a public building in a parked van weren't sufficient grounds for law enforcement intervention. Moreover, Bob's military experience had taught him to be suspicious of official responses that might complicate tactical situations. Instead, he began his own preparation. Bob quietly activated the building's internal security systems, switched the elevator controls to manual override, and sent a subtle alert to the private security company that monitored the building's alarms.
He also moved his patrol route to keep him closer to the main lobby, where he'd be positioned to respond to any breach of the building's perimeter. At 9:47 p.m., 3 armed men entered Metropolitan Financial Tower through the parking garage entrance, which they'd accessed using stolen keycards and detailed knowledge of the building's security systems. They moved with military precision, wearing dark tactical clothing and carrying automatic weapons that suggested serious criminal intent rather than simple robbery. Bob saw them on the security cameras before they reached the main lobby. His training took over immediately, muscle memory and tactical conditioning that had been dormant for years but never truly forgotten. The soft-spoken security guard who'd been reading a Tom Clancy novel disappeared, replaced by Chief Petty Officer Patterson, SEAL Team 6. Bob's first priority was gathering intelligence. The 3 intruders appeared professional but not military. Their movement patterns and equipment handling suggested criminal experience rather than formal tactical training. They were armed with AR-15-style rifles, wore body armor, and carried equipment that indicated they intended to control the building for an extended period. The lead intruder, a tall man with visible tattoos, was directing his team toward the elevator bank while speaking into a radio headset. Bob couldn't hear the conversation, but the coordination suggested additional personnel outside the building. This wasn't a simple armed robbery. It was a complex operation with multiple phases and specific objectives. Bob's second priority was force protection. He quickly identified 17 people still in the building: 12 office workers, 4 cleaning staff, and Dr. Martinez. Most were on upper floors and unaware of the situation, which meant Bob had a brief window to neutralize the threat before it could spread throughout the building. The tactical mathematics were challenging but not impossible. 3 armed opponents, superior firepower, unknown objectives, civilian hostages in a confined space. Bob had faced worse odds in places like Syria and Afghanistan, but he'd had teammates, air support, and rules of engagement that didn't include protecting bystanders. When the 3 gunmen reached the main lobby, they found what appeared to be an elderly security guard sitting calmly behind his desk, hands visible, showing no signs of resistance or alarm. "You," the lead gunman called out, pointing his rifle at Bob. "Get up slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them." Bob complied exactly, rising from his chair with the deliberate movements of someone trying not to provoke an armed confrontation. His body language communicated submission and compliance, which was precisely what he intended. "Please don't hurt anyone," Bob said in the mild, slightly worried tone he'd perfected during his years of civilian employment. "I've got a family. I'll cooperate with whatever you need." The gunman relaxed slightly, categorizing Bob as a non-threat, an aging rent-a-cop who wouldn't interfere with their operation. It was exactly the assessment Bob had wanted them to make. What they couldn't see was that Bob's apparent compliance was actually tactical positioning. He'd moved to a spot that gave him cover behind a marble pillar while keeping all 3 gunmen within his field of vision. His hands, raised in apparent surrender, were actually calculating distances, angles, and the sequence of movements that would give him the best chance of neutralizing multiple armed opponents. The transformation happened in the space between heartbeats. The nervous security guard vanished, replaced by a predator who'd spent 2 decades perfecting the art of close-quarters combat against armed opponents. Bob's first target was the gunman closest to the elevator, who'd made the tactical error of turning his back to scan the upper floors. Bob covered the 12 feet between them in less than 2 seconds, moving with the explosive speed that had once made him invaluable to special operations commanders. The engagement lasted 23 seconds from initiation to completion. Though Bob's perception of time had slowed to the hyper-focused state that SEALs called tactical time, the psychological condition where training overtook conscious thought and muscle memory guided action, the first gunman never knew what hit him. Bob's approach was silent, his strike precisely targeted to disable rather than kill. A single blow to the base of the skull rendered the man unconscious while Bob simultaneously stripped his weapon and used his body as cover against the remaining 2 opponents. The second gunman, positioned near the building's information desk, had time to recognize the threat and attempt to bring his weapon to bear. But Bob was already moving, using the lobby's marble columns for concealment, while advancing on an angle that prevented either remaining gunman from achieving a clear shot without risk of hitting his partner. Bob's acquired AR-15 provided superior firepower, but the confined space and civilian considerations meant he couldn't simply eliminate the threats with overwhelming force. Instead, he employed the precise, controlled tactics that special operations units used when collateral damage wasn't acceptable. A single shot to the second gunman's weapon hand rendered him combat ineffective while preserving his life. The third gunman, now isolated and facing an opponent whose tactical capabilities far exceeded his own, attempted to surrender. "Drop the weapon," Bob commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Face down on the floor, hands behind your head, fingers interlaced." The gunman complied immediately, recognizing that he was no longer in control of the situation. Bob secured all 3 weapons, zip-tied the conscious prisoners with restraints from his security kit, and called 911 with a report that was models of tactical precision. "This is Robert Patterson, Metropolitan Financial Tower Security. 3 armed subjects neutralized, building secure, no civilian casualties. Requesting police response and medical assistance." The Seattle Police Department's response to Bob's call was initially skeptical. Security guards didn't typically neutralize multiple armed gunmen single-handedly. The first officers on scene expected to find either a confused civilian or a crime scene involving multiple casualties. Instead, they discovered 3 professional criminals secured and disarmed by a soft-spoken security guard who provided a detailed tactical briefing with military precision. Bob's incident report noted exact times, weapon types, ammunition counts, and tactical assessments that demonstrated expertise far beyond civilian security training. Detective Lisa Rodriguez, a 15-year SPD veteran who'd seen her share of unusual situations, found herself questioning a security guard whose account of events didn't match his apparent background. "Mr. Patterson," she said, reviewing her notes, "walk me through this again. You're telling me that 3 armed men entered the building, took hostages, and you neutralized all of them without anyone getting hurt." "That's correct, Detective, and you did this using tactics that frankly sound more like military special operations than building security." Bob met her gaze steadily. "I have some prior military experience." "What kind of prior military experience?" "The classified kind." Detective Rodriguez had dealt with enough veterans to recognize when she was encountering someone with a background that couldn't be easily explained. Bob's calm demeanor, tactical precision, and matter-of-fact description of disarming multiple gunmen suggested training that went well beyond standard military service. "Mr. Patterson, I'm going to need to verify your background through appropriate channels. In the meantime, you're obviously not a threat to public safety, but this situation is going to require extensive investigation." Bob nodded understanding. He'd known that using his skills would inevitably expose aspects of his past that he'd worked to keep private. The choice had been between maintaining his anonymity and protecting innocent lives. For a man who'd spent 22 years serving others, it hadn't really been a choice at all. The investigation into the attempted robbery at Metropolitan Financial Tower attracted attention from multiple agencies. The FBI became involved due to the sophisticated nature of the operation and evidence suggesting the gunman had been conducting surveillance for several weeks. The Seattle Police Department's SWAT team reviewed Bob's actions for potential tactical lessons. Most significantly, Naval Criminal Investigative Service opened a file to verify Bob's background and ensure that no classified information had been compromised. The 3 gunmen, all of whom survived their encounter with Bob, were identified as professional criminals with extensive records of armed robbery and assault. Under interrogation, they admitted that they'd expected to encounter minimal resistance from building security and had planned to hold hostages while demanding ransom from several high-profile tenants. "We researched the building for months," the lead gunman told investigators. "We knew there was just one security guard on the night shift, some old guy who read books and looked harmless. We had no idea we were walking into a damn Navy SEAL." That statement, reported in local media, was the first public indication that Bob Patterson wasn't the ordinary security guard he appeared to be. The story gained national attention when security camera footage of Bob's actions was analyzed by law enforcement and military consultants. The footage showed textbook examples of close-quarters combat techniques that were taught only to elite military units. Bob's movement patterns, weapon handling, and tactical decisions were consistent with special operations training at the highest levels. Media outlets began investigating Bob's background, though his military records remained classified. What they discovered was a decorated Navy veteran who'd served for 22 years and retired with full honors. The specific nature of his service remained officially confidential, but sources familiar with special operations confirmed that Bob had served with units whose existence was rarely acknowledged publicly. The aftermath of the incident transformed Bob's quiet life in ways he hadn't anticipated. Building tenants who'd previously ignored him now stopped to thank him personally. Dr. Martinez brought him coffee and asked about his well-being. James Chen offered to provide legal services pro bono if Bob needed assistance with the investigation. More significantly, Bob received contact from former colleagues who'd seen the news reports and recognized the tactical signatures of his actions. His former commanding officer, now a retired admiral, called personally to express pride in Bob's actions and offer assistance with any complications arising from the publicity. "Bob," Admiral Williams said during their phone conversation, "you've reminded everyone why SEALs never really retire. You just find new ways to serve." The conversation meant more to Bob than any civilian recognition he'd received. For 3 years, he'd felt disconnected from the identity and purpose that had defined most of his adult life. The incident at Metropolitan Financial Tower hadn't just protected innocent people, it had reminded him that his skills and experience still had value, even in civilian contexts. Several private security companies approached Bob with job offers that would have tripled his salary and provided opportunities to use his tactical expertise professionally. The Department of Homeland Security expressed interest in consulting arrangements. A major defense contractor offered a position that would have restored his access to classified projects. Bob considered each opportunity carefully, but ultimately decided to remain in his position at Metropolitan Financial Tower. The job provided the stability and routine he'd learned to value, while the incident had demonstrated that his presence served as protection for people who didn't even know they needed protecting. 6 months after the attempted robbery, Bob had settled into a routine that was similar to his previous one, but fundamentally different in important ways. He still worked the night shift, still read paperback novels during quiet hours, still maintained the low profile he preferred. But his relationship with the building's tenants had evolved into something approaching mutual respect and recognition. People greeted him by name now, asked about his well-being, and treated him as a valued member of the building's community rather than part of the infrastructure. Dr. Martinez had invited him to a PTSD support group for veterans, which Bob attended occasionally when his work schedule allowed. Most importantly, Bob had begun to see his security work as a continuation of his military service rather than a retreat from it. The skills that had made him valuable to special operations commanders, situational awareness, tactical assessment, protective instincts, were equally applicable to civilian security responsibilities. He'd also begun sharing some of his knowledge with other security personnel, providing informal training in threat assessment and emergency response. Danny Morrison, the day shift guard, had become something of a protege, learning to read body language and recognize potential problems before they escalated. "Bob," Danny said one evening as they changed shifts, "I want you to know that working with you has changed how I think about this job. I used to see it as just checking IDs and watching cameras. Now I understand we're actually protecting people." Bob nodded approvingly. "The job is what you make of it, Danny. Everything we do here matters, even when no one notices." Robert Patterson continues to work the night shift at Metropolitan Financial Tower, maintaining his quiet vigil over 3,000 people who trust their safety to his care. The attempted robbery has become part of building lore, a story told to new tenants about the unassuming security guard who turned out to be a decorated special operations veteran. Bob has declined most interview requests and media opportunities, preferring to maintain the privacy he'd cultivated during his civilian transition. He's been recognized by the Seattle Police Department, the FBI, and several veterans organizations, but he displays no awards or certificates in his modest apartment. What has changed is Bob's understanding of his role in civilian society. The transition from military service to civilian employment had been difficult, partly because he'd viewed it as a step backward from meaningful service to mundane employment. The incident at Metropolitan Financial Tower had shown him that service takes many forms and that protecting innocent people is always meaningful work, regardless of the context. The building's tenants go about their daily routines, secure in the knowledge that their safety is maintained by someone with the skills and dedication to handle any threat that might arise. They may not fully understand Bob's background or capabilities, but they recognize that he represents something valuable, a commitment to protecting others that transcends job descriptions or salary considerations. Late at night, when the building is quiet and most of the city sleeps, Bob continues his rounds through empty hallways and vacant offices. His trained eyes scan for anomalies, his experienced mind processes potential threats, and his steady presence provides security that goes far beyond checking IDs and monitoring cameras. He's found peace in the routine, purpose in the responsibility, and satisfaction in the knowledge that his skills developed through decades of military service continue to serve the cause of protecting innocent people from those who would do them harm. Chief Petty Officer Robert Patterson may have retired from the Navy, but he never stopped being a guardian. He simply found a new post to defend, a new mission to fulfill, and a new way to serve his country by protecting its citizens one quiet night at a time. The robbery that went wrong in those crucial seconds had reminded everyone, including Bob himself, that heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry official credentials. Sometimes they sit behind security desks, stamp parking passes, and wait patiently for the moment when their training, experience, and commitment to protecting others makes all the difference in the world. So now I ask you, have you ever encountered someone whose quiet competence suggested depths you couldn't imagine? Someone whose calm demeanor hinted at experiences beyond ordinary civilian life? Someone who chose humble service over recognition or acclaim? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the hidden protectors in your own community, because here at Interesting Human Stories, we believe that the most powerful guardians are often the ones who never need to prove their strength. They just show up, do their job, and stand ready to act when ordinary people need extraordinary protection. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it. Help us honor the veterans and protectors who continue serving long after their official duties have ended. The quiet professionals who watch over us all, one shift at a time. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember, the person checking your ID, monitoring your building's security, or working the night shift at your office might be carrying more capability, more experience, and more dedication than you could ever imagine, and that's exactly how they prefer it.